When it comes to loading related objects, we have two fetching strategies. The first strategy is eager loading, which means related objects are immediately loaded. This is the default strategy for one-to-one and many-to-one relationships, but we can always change it if we want to. We also have another strategy called lazy loading, which means related objects are loaded when accessed. This is the default strategy for one-to-many and many-to-many relationships. And again, we can change this if we want to. Let's see these strategies in action. Now, back to the user entity. Look, we have a one-to-one relationship to the profile entity. Now, whenever we have one object on the other end of a relationship, the default fetching strategy is eager loading. So when we retrieve a user, the profile is also loaded. To see this in action, let's go to our user service class and add a new method, public void show related entities. Here we use user repository to find a user by ID. Now let's take a look at my database. In this database, I have a couple of users. I'm going to grab the user with the ID of 2. So let's grab this user, or else throw. We get a user object and then print user.email. Now we go back to our store application class. Here in the main method, we call show related entities. Let's run the application. All right, look, we are selecting all these columns from the user table and a bunch more columns from the profiles table. And by the way, these P1s and U1s, these are aliases. So over here, look, when we are selecting data from the users table, we have an alias for this table called U1_0. And similarly, after we do a join to the profiles table, we have an alias P10 for the profiles table. So this is eager loading in action. Now we can change this strategy and use lazy loading. To do that, where we define our relationship, we set the fetch attribute to, now it's suggesting to use eager, but I'm going to change this to lazy. Now, right away, we see a warning. This is coming from JPA body. Let's take a look. It says specifying fetch type lazy for the non-owning side of the one-to-one association will not affect the loading. What this is telling us is that with one-to-one relationships, we cannot apply a fetch strategy on the non-owning side of a relationship. What does it mean? We talked about the concept of ownership between the user and profile entities. Which entity is the owner? It's the profile. That's where we have the foreign key or join column annotation. So here in the profile entity, we have the join column annotation. This is the owner of the relationship. So that warning is saying that we can only apply the fetch strategy here. So let's set it to fetch type lazy, okay? And remove it from the user entity. Let's run the application again. All right, look, we're still selecting all these columns from the user table as well as the columns from the profiles table. But didn't we use lazy loading? Here's the catch. In one-to-one relationships, changing the fetch strategy only impacts the owner of the relationship. So even though we are using lazy loading in the profile entity, it's not going to impact the user entity. So what can we do here? How can we fetch a user without its profile? Here we have two options. One option is to comment out this field or this relationship altogether. Now, if you run the application again, look, we're only selecting the columns from the users table. There is no join to the profiles table. So this is one way, and it's probably a good way in a real-world application. Because this user entity represents a user account, this is where we have fields like username, email, password, and so on. So this entity is used for authentication. So when fetching a user, we probably don't need the profile information, okay? So one way is to remove this relationship. But if you still need to have this here for some other reason, there is another way to solve this problem using advanced querying. We'll talk about that later in this section. Now, I'm going to bring this back. Now let's work on the other end of the relationship. So in the profile entity, we're using lazy loading. Let's see this in action. So first we need to add a profile repository. Here in the repositories package, let's add a new repository for the profile entity. And we select CRUD repository as the parent. Let's go ahead, good. Now let's go to our profiles table and add a record for one of our users. So we click up here to add a row. We set the ID to the ID of one of our users. On my machine, I have 213. I'm going to go with 2. Now I'm going to set bio to bio, leave out the other columns, and just submit the changes to the database. Good. Now we go back to our user service. In this class, we add a profile repository. So private final profile repository. Now back to our method. Instead of fetching a user, let's fetch a profile. So profile repository. We get this profile. Let's rename this object to profile. Then instead of printing email, let's print bio. Let's run the application. All right, look, we're only selecting the columns from the profiles table. There is no join to the users table, okay? But if we go back to our method and access the user associated with this profile, there will be a second query to the database to retrieve the user object. This is lazy loading. So let's call getUser and then print the email. Let's run the application. All right, we got an exception of type lazy initialization exception. Why are we getting this? Here's the reason. We talked about transaction boundaries. I told you that all repository methods like find, delete, and save are transactional. So when this method is called, a new transaction starts, and when the method completes, the transaction ends. So after this line, when we get to the second line, there's no transaction, which means there's no persistence context. So this profile object is no longer managed or tracked by Hibernate. So when we try to access the user of this profile, we get that exception because there is no persistence context and Hibernate doesn't know how to get the user associated with the profile. To solve this issue, we have to apply the transactional annotation here. So we keep our transaction open throughout this method. And that means the persistence context is going to stay there. So Hibernate will be able to track our profile object. Let's run this again. All right. Now look, we have two queries, one for selecting profile information and the other for selecting user information. And here's the email. Okay. So to recap, when we have only one object on the other end of a relationship, like one-to-one or many-to-one, the default strategy is eager loading. For other relationships, like one-to-many or many-to-many, the default strategy is lazy loading. Now, practically speaking, we should use eager loading when we always need the related data and use lazy loading for relationships that are optional or rarely accessed.